morning and welcome to Morning Movie News, where late Friday, Lucasfilm went out of their way to make sure that people knew that a story that had originated out of the UK was incorrect. And that was someone claiming that they had an inside source at Lucasfilm that said that Rogue One was the road map when it came to utilizing Princess Leia in future Star Wars movies after the tragic death of Carrie Fisher. And that story started to get a lot of momentum. So Lucasfilm did something they don't usually do, and that's they commented on speculation. And they said there are no plans to do a digital version of Carrie Fisher, which I have mixed feelings about. I think that Rogue One was very well received, with Peter Cushing being brought back digitally and a younger Carrie Fisher. But of course, Peter Cushing has been, passed away for quite some time now. And also, it didn't have the same tragic circumstances. Maybe in the far future they might have a digital Carrie Fisher. But I think that what's interesting about what happened with Carrie Fisher is that we talk about SJWs all the time. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's social justice warriors. But because I think of Carrie Fisher's tragic relationship with both substance abuse and mental illness, there was a really swift claim of ownership over her passing from a number of groups. And you saw some really aggressive developments on Twitter. I ran into a problem with some people, and even Steve Martin had to delete a tweet, I think, very inappropriately. Steve Martin tweeted that when he first met Carrie Fisher, he thought she was a beautiful young woman, but then came to discover she was so much more. And he got such heat for defining Carrie Fisher by her physical qualities that he had to delete a tweet. And, Steve Martin was actually friends with Carrie Fisher, so she clearly wasn't offended by, how he felt about her. And, Carrie Fisher, took a lot of personal offense, and I think it was hard for her that, comments about how she looked physically when she got older, especially when she was going to come back for the new Star Wars films. But she's someone who was very proud of how she looked when she first was in the Star Wars movies, and talks about how impressed she, up to the very end, talked about how she thought she looked really great, and that she worked hard to look so good. So it's a complicated situation, which I think is, I was going to say women, but I think men and women today have a complicated relationship with how they look and how much importance should be placed on that, etc. But I thought that there was nothing wrong with Steve Martin's tweet, and the fact that he had to delete a tweet about a close friend of his, trying to say something nice about her and her passing and remembering her, I think, just shows how far it's gone. The situation has gone on, not only in social media, but particularly when it comes to Carrie Fisher. So I can understand Star Wars, and Lucasfilm not wanting to go there, not wanting to have to deal with that. They don't want that kind of negative publicity. I feel that the negative publicity around Moana and that Halloween costume for Maui about my culture is not a costume did, to some degree, take some of the wind out of the sails of Moana. So I can see why Disney's decided to, and Lucasfilm have decided to release this statement and say they're not going to do a digital Carrie Fisher. And maybe they can get away with it in saying that because she did finish filming for episode 8. So they don't need, the question is, will they rewrite some scenes so she'll die off camera for episode 9? They could bring her back as a digital Carrie Fisher for episode 9, and that would be, of course, years from now. As I said in my video when Carrie Fisher tragically passed away, that I think that it would be a disservice to the character not to let her finish her story on screen. And I think that there's now a precedent for it, a very successful precedent. You had not only Peter Cushing, but I thought that the way they handled the Paul Walker situation in the Fast and the Furious franchise was incredibly touching. The goodbye that they allowed him to have on camera at the end of Furious 7 was one of the most powerful bits of filmmaking I've ever seen. I was bawling in the theater. I cried again in my review just thinking about it. It still touches me just thinking about it now. And I think that you give Carrie Fisher and her Princess Leia character that moment on screen would be a beautiful thing. And it would be unfortunate if, again, some very aggressive groups on social media were to rob her of that legacy. I think it would go a long way with the character going forward. I'm not saying use digital Carrie Fisher forever. I'm saying let digital Carrie Fisher finish the Princess Leia story. But I'm curious how you feel about it. And do you think that Lucasfilm is, being able to use some, like a loophole here, and that we have no plans for Digital Carrie Fisher for episode 8, but do you think that sometime in the future you can see them going with Digital Carrie Fisher? So it'll be interesting to see how Lucasfilm handles her passing. But I think that not going with the Digital Carrie Fisher, I think personally, is a mistake. But we'll see. We'll see how it turns out. Now, the second story of the day is also controversial, and this was a big headline over the weekend, and that's that Mel Gibson has signed with Creative Artists Agency. He has not had a traditional agent since 2010, when William Morris Endeavor dropped him with all the controversy over his comments, anti-Semitic and misogynistic comments that he was making. He also made racist comments. You know, he was recorded telling his girlfriend that he hoped she got raped by a pack of the N-word for African Americans. And so he was in a very dark place, and really nobody wanted to touch this guy with a 10-foot pole. So he did have representation, though. Rick Nacita managed him and basically acted as his sole representation since 2010. And Rick Nacita comes from CAA. But Rick Nacita, it turns out, is going to go into producing now. He's not going to have any more clients. So why did CAA take Mel Gibson, though? Well, a couple of reasons. I think the most obvious is that Hacksaw Ridge has done quite well. It's gotten Golden Globe nominations, is expected to get Oscar nominations, and it also made $160 million worldwide so far off of a $40 million budget. That's fantastic. But the other problem is that CAA had a number of its clients poached recently, I believe by William Morris Endeavor. So they're having a little bit of a problem. I think they lost their whole comedy department, their whole roster of comedy talent. So they need to just, get some big names back on board. So I think that they're a good match for Mel Gibson right now. I think that Mel Gibson, he has a Sean Penn movie that he's co-starring in coming up. I suspect that Mel Gibson will continue to work, and he'll be let back into Hollywood a little bit, but not in front of the camera. I think it's very unlikely he'll be able to stay in front of the camera. I mean, I think he'll make little side movies like with Sean Penn, who also is a very controversial figure, that'll be like, fringe films, but I think his days of starring in major films are over. But that's not to say he can't direct movies, particularly since he, is not so much a director for hire, but he's his own movie factory. He comes up with great ideas. Like he wants to do a sequel to Passion of the Christ, which I think sounds quite good, the way he's pitching it, having Christ descend into hell as he does in the Bible. I mean, who doesn't want to see Mel Gibson's version of hell? I think that would be fascinating. And also he wants to do something on, like, I believe the Medici banking family in Italy, from like the Renaissance and stuff. I think that just sounds so good. I mean, he has really interesting ideas for movies, and he brings something to the table that nobody else in Hollywood is doing, which I also think benefits him. So I think that you're going to continue to hear from Mel Gibson, but again, I suspect that he'll try to go in front of the camera, but it's not going to work. But I'm curious, how do you feel about Mel Gibson? And I know that so many of you are going to say, well, what about Nate Parker? Why Mel Gibson and not Nate Parker? Well, 6 years. It took 6 years for Mel Gibson to come back. As I'm saying, I don't think he's going to be able to come back as an actor. And also, I think he's done some mea culpas. He's really kind of done a little bit of an apology tour. I don't know if he's really said he's sorry, but he has admitted that he really hurt his career and it's his own fault. And I think people still have very complicated feelings about Mel Gibson. I've read, coverage of the screenings for Hacksaw Ridge with people saying, I didn't want to like that movie, but I did. And you'll notice that Hacksaw Ridge, while being nominated, hasn't won anything outside of Australia, where it did quite well at the Australian version of the Academy Awards, their Oscars. But he, of course, is an Australian talent. So I think that there is a path back to Hollywood. And I don't know we'll see if Nate Parker can walk it. As many of you pointed out, he was nominated for Best First Time Feature Director by the Directors Guild of America. So that's promising. His peers did recognize his work. And it is a good movie. He does know Mel Gibson, so maybe Mel Gibson can perhaps mentor him. But it's going to be a tough road for him. I think, I don't know. What Mel Gibson said was really horrible, too. So maybe Nate Parker could continue behind the camera. We'll have to see how that turns out. Now, another interesting situation that's developing is over at Sony. Many of you pointed this out to me. It was revealed late on Friday by Michael Lynton himself that he's leaving Sony, and he's failing upwards. Sony has done quite poorly for itself as a movie company in 2016. As I discussed in the top 10 movies of the year, box office-wise, their highest movie in the worldwide box office was number 22 with Angry Birds. That's pretty dismal. But he failed upwards because he's leaving the company to go run Snapchat, to be the head of Snapchat with some very healthy stock options. And it's interesting because when the Sony hack occurred, it became clear from the leaked emails that he was looking for an out from the company even then. But even with all that happening publicly, he still got hired at Snapchat, which is amazing. You know, it's such a tight-knit community of who you know, and there's so many politics involved that it's interesting to see that these executives, you know, even when they do something horrible, they're able to stay alive. It's a really, I think, a difficult part of business culture, and I'm not quite sure how it can be broken. But Snapchat's hired him, and he's going over there. He said he'd like to help with the transition of power at Sony for the next 6 months, but everyone's saying that's unlikely because it puts Sony in too much of a gray area. Because, you know, as other producers and, you know, agencies package movies, they're not going to want to take them to a studio that's up in the air in terms of leadership. So they think Michael Lynton will be phased out pretty quickly, and they're also curious as to who will head the motion picture division. Michael Lynton, I think, heads up all of Sony Entertainment in the United States. But anyway, they said the strongest thing at Sony right now is the PlayStation brand. It does very well as a PlayStation console, and it has a lot of good brands. Also, it's like one of the most places to stream Netflix, which I thought was very interesting. But Sony also, of course, has the Spider-Man characters. They said over 800 Spider-Man characters, Spider-Man affiliated characters are theirs. That's amazing. Wow. Just it shows you how bad a situation Marvel was in when they were in bankruptcy and had to make this sale to Sony. And they also, of course, I don't know if they renewed the Bond deal yet, but Bond has typically been at home at Sony. So there's something of value at Sony Entertainment, but here's the rumor of what's going to happen next, okay? So either it will continue as is and they'll get new management, or some people are saying there's some chance that Japan, Sony, wants to divest themselves of Columbia Pictures and all their entertainment holdings, which I think sounds absolutely ridiculous. That would be so embarrassing, and to just totally get out of the entertainment business because you've had a couple of bad years. Why not hire some better executives, right? I mean, they have fabulous, when you have PlayStation, Spider-Man, and Bond, who walks away from that? But the rumor is that they might, and they would sell to CBS. Now, this is where things get ridiculously complicated, and I can't believe the government would approve this. Especially because it says that, therefore, if they were to make the sale, it would give Sony some holdings in CBS, which is a major network in the United States, and the government probably wouldn't accept that. But CBS has CBS Films, which, you know, obviously not a great, shingle, and not a great distributor. But what would happen is that CBS, Les Moonves and CBS would purchase Sony, and then both Sony and Paramount would be two studios under the Viacom banner, and that Viacom could maybe combine them into a super studio. That's like one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. If that happened, I just can't imagine that the government would allow that. And to have, what would you have, like Sony Paramount, or Paramount Sony Pictures, or Paramount Columbia? I mean, it just sounds absolutely ridiculous. And I think Sony can exist on its own. I don't know why another buyer wouldn't come in. Why wouldn't sell to... I don't think Viacom should be allowed to own two movie studios. They've got a television network, and they've got a movie studio, and they have several cable channels. They're good. I think that's just too much of a conglomerate. But, I mean, we'll see what happens. I think that's a crazy rumor. But it's my duty to tell you what the industry is talking about, and this rumor is covered in the major trades, so people feel it's like somewhat legit. But what do you think? What do you think of Michael Lynton failing upwards? What do you think of the future for Sony? And, some of you asked me, well, what will happen if Sony does sell to CBS, and CBS therefore owns the Spider-Man? I think that would complicate things immensely because, where would it air on networks? But, and Marvel, I think, would be powerless to stop such a deal because, as I've said before, Sony partially owns the Spider-Man character. Maybe that Marvel and Disney could buy it back if it's up for sale. I'd be like, what? It's like a garage sale. I'd be like, how much for just Spider-Man and his 799 friends? We'll see what happens. But that's just a mess. And, it just goes to show that it's not a good idea. I mean, Marvel had no choice because they were in bankruptcy. But it's not a good idea to spread your characters out amongst several companies because look at the mess that it's made. All right, so anyway, those are the three stories of the day. Now, I have a very interesting viewer question that several of you said, oh, yes, please pick this one. So I did. This is from Ingvild R. What a great name. Hello, Ingvild. And Ingvild says, Grace, we often talk about people being, quote-unquote, box office poison, but almost every actor, director, etc. has had a flop at some point in their career. When does a flop going from being an exception to the rule in someone's career? How many flops are you allowed before you were considered to be bad to have in a movie? Love your show, Ingvild, great question. Really good question. Of course, everyone's allowed to have a flop here and there. It happens to everyone. But with so much in Hollywood, it's all about perception. Like, for instance, Ryan Gosling has horrible box office. But because he's getting so many awards right now, and if he wins the Oscar, he's going to sign a slew of deals because he's going to look really good. Also, he has Blade Runner coming up. So people are like, okay, I'm going to bet that Ryan Gosling is at a turning point in his career. Even though he's been rejected by movie audiences up until this point, I'm going to choose to believe, I'm going to gamble that he's, going to turn a corner as an actor and as a commodity. And so that's what's happening to his career right now, even though his box office numbers are quite bad. And that does happen. People do turn a corner in their careers. I don't think that's a bad bet. And I think that Ryan Gosling, I think he's probably getting a lot of great deals. I can't imagine his paydays going up that dramatically. I think the payday is that he's getting deals. And also Emily Blunt, for instance, got a lot of stuff off of Edge of Tomorrow because she was so well received by fans and by the media, and she was in a Tom Cruise movie. But I think she's proven since then to continue to be a problem at the box office. Chris Pine, who's going to play Steve Trevor? He gets the call. I think because that's a difficult role to cast. Who wants to be Wonder Woman's boyfriend? I think they're doing a good job with it so far, but it's tricky. But he's also struggled, I think, at the box office, and so that's why he has trouble getting work. But it's all about perception, and not only the perception, by the general audience, but how an agent and manager can twist that perception when they're in the room, when they're pitching their client to the studio or the producers. So I think that overall, though, when someone goes from box office, just a regular person to box office poison, it's all about the ratio. What's the balance? How many flops do you have to hits? Because as you said, Ingvild, everybody has a flop. And so sometimes also you have to see, well, why was there a flop? Was it because the actor was trying something new and it just didn't work? For instance, Paul Newman has that famous quote where he says, in the right movie, I'm priceless. But, again, he was pointing out it has to be the right movie. And Tom Hanks, I think, is a great example. For a while there, every single movie that Tom Hanks was in was a success because audiences just trusted him. And I think Leonardo DiCaprio enjoys that to some degree today. But Tom Hanks hit a bad patch where he made a lot of movies that didn't do well consistently. And because he consistently wasn't performing at the box office, people started to say, well, maybe audiences are over you. Maybe they don't trust you. Sully was a bit of a return to form for him, but then he wiped it out with Inferno right afterwards. But you might recall he had Cloud Atlas. He had that movie with Julia Roberts that he was in. A lot of movies, he made too many flops. Russell Crowe had the same problem, just too many flops in a row where people start to get nervous. And that's, also, if you have too many flops and there are too many headlines associated with your movies tanking, then people start to say they're worried about the perception of their movie. And they say, well, if you're in my movie, people are going to start to think that maybe my movie's not so good, right? That's very scary. People say, oh, these kind of movies never do well, so I don't want you in my film. Russell Crowe's an interesting choice because look at Nice Guys. A lot of you picked Nice Guys for one of your best movies of the year. But because it had Russell Crowe and Ryan Gosling, it obviously did not do well at the box office because both of their box office track records are poor, and it indicates that audiences just aren't interested in seeing them, at least in the theater, right? So Ryan Gosling, we just talked about him having an interesting situation where he might be turning a corner. But then, of course, Russell Crowe is in the new Mummy movie opposite Tom Cruise. But I think what's interesting there is that you're like, listen, this is Russell Crowe in a supporting role. He's supporting in a Tom Cruise movie. So, and we're just trying to get up the star power for this film. But I think it's a risk. I think sometimes still, it hasn't been disproven that when people see Russell Crowe on screen, they don't have this Pavlovian response of not going to pay to see it in the theater. And we'll see what the Mummy's box office numbers look like because Tom Cruise, while he's turned another corner, he had a bad patch there for a while. He's proven to be quite the box office commodity with Mission Impossible. The last Mission Impossible did incredibly well. So they're betting that he's back, but we'll see. It might just be that he's back in that franchise, and that I think that that was just a very good movie that was very well reviewed, and had great trailers. So I think that, again, I think the important thing for you to take away here is that it's all about perception. What are the headlines saying about you? That's why the media is so important with this. What do the numbers look like? Are you popular around town? A lot of times actors just keep working because they're so nice. You just want to be around them, and you like, who do I want to spend 3 months with on a set? Who do I want to go on a press tour with? Who do I want to help? Who do I want to feel good about helping someone's career and improving the quality of their life with this success, right? For instance, I did the junket for Gold yesterday, and Bryce Dallas Howard was so incredibly nice that you were like, oh, I'm starting to see why you get gigs perhaps over other actresses that maybe aren't as nice. And you go, you know what? Her father's Ron Howard. She's super nice. I can see wanting to be around her and, helping her career. So I think that's very interesting. Same for Edgar Ramirez. He was also incredibly nice. So sometimes, when you see someone on screen and you're like, I don't know why that person's working so much. It might be a situation where they're good. I mean, they don't blow you away on camera, but behind the scenes, they're just so wonderful. Same about Bill Paxton. Bill Paxton is one of the nicest people you will ever meet. He's like almost like unheard of levels of nice and fun. And that's why he continues to get work for his whole career. People just like having him around. So there's a lot of different things that factor into, how, and also Billy Bob Thornton, for instance, the rumor is that he's horrible to work with, and so nobody wants to work with him. And I was talking about Denzel Washington not working with name directors, and some of you pointed out that he has a bad reputation for working with people. So no matter, even if he's Denzel Washington, even if his box office usually is pretty good, I think a lot of directors say, well, I don't need Denzel's box office because I have myself, or I have my own reputation, or I can go get somebody else. I don't want to put up with him for 3 months. So I think, so again, it's perception. It's perception. It's a business of who you know. It's a business of relationships. And that's all very important. So I hope that gives you some perspective of how someone becomes labeled box office poison. And it's all about, and also look for momentum. How many flops has the person had? I think once you get beyond, 3, or 2 even, you're in pretty bad shape. Also, the last thing I want to say is I've always talked to you about, when you have a movie about to come out, you should sign your next deal. So just so you can make sure that you have something in the bank, right? And so I think that sometimes your flops have so many flops in a row that you stop getting the next offer, right? So when the movie does flop, you don't have another movie that you're already working on, and that puts you in a bad position. I think Michael Fassbender is approaching box office poison levels. He was really hot there for a while, but I think after Macbeth, The Light Between Oceans, and now Assassin's Creed, I think that he's got a little bit of a stink about him. He's starting to smell a little bit at the box office, right? And I think that he should be concerned about his career going forward. And I don't know. I mean, he's supposed to be Magneto, but there's rumors, of course, of that X-Men reboot. And I think that while they decide who to keep, if anyone at all, I think that that's going to influence their decision and be like, clearly Michael Fassbender isn't a draw. So I'm curious, what do you guys think? When do you start to feel that someone's box office poison? Does this sound fair to you? Does it make sense to you? Thank you so much for your question, Ingvild. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Please write down below today's top 3 stories, Ingvild's viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.